Good afternoon. Welcome to the APA Washington Chapter's Climate Initiatives Forum webinar. Thank you for taking a lunch hour with us. My name is Paula Reeves, and I'm the chapter president for APA Washington. I want to welcome you and also let you know just a couple housekeeping items. We'll be taking your questions throughout the session. Over on the right-hand side of your screen, about halfway down, you'll see a questions item, a header, and you're welcome to enter your questions at any point in the discussion. And Yorick Stevens will pull those questions up at the end for discussion. Also, we'll be making a PDF file of the presentation materials available to you at the webinar. We'll post those on our website for those that couldn't attend. And I just want to give you a quick welcome and overview of how we got to the point of holding this event and thank our speakers as well. We have been talking about climate for years and years as Washington planners. And in our strategic planning efforts this summer, this was identified as a priority in our recent member survey. This is something that you all identified as a desire to have more training. And with things heating up in our legislative session this year, with several ballot measures and other proposals and initiatives being considered, I think it's very important for us all to get accurate information and for you all to think about that information as you're getting it today to help APA Washington formulate an opinion and determine our position. So please think about those things, and when this is over, consider joining us as a part of our Climate Ad Hoc Committee and participating in determining that position, making some recommendations to our board, our chair, Justice Stewart, and in conjunction with others that have been engaged in this conversation for a long time. I know that Lynn Keegan is still engaged and appreciate your involvement in that work. So without more delay, I'll turn it over to Yorick, who will tell you a little bit more background about APA's climate efforts.
Great, thank you, Paula. Hi, this is Yorick Stevens Watched. I'm one of the co-chairs of APA Washington's Legislative Action Committee, along with Esther Larson. Just want to echo Paula's sincere thanks to everyone who's participating in this webinar, both as speakers, but also those of you that are listening in and looking for ways to get informed and potentially get engaged on this issue. So one of the things I wanted to do is just run through a few of the ways that APA is currently addressing climate change and some good opportunities to get even more information. As Paula mentioned, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, climate change appears as one of the chapter's priority items on the chapter's 2016 legislative agenda. Climate change also featured prominently in the 2012 agenda as well, so it's something that's been on our radar screen for a while, and as Paula mentioned, this is something that we saw identified in our member survey from a few years back. You can see this year's legislative agenda to see how both climate change figures in it as well as some of the other priorities for the chapter by going to the chapter website, washington-apa.org. and then take a look under resources and you'll see the legislative agenda under there. You can also see the legislative committee's webpage under Get Involved. And if any of that inspires you for interest in the legislative committee, definitely let either myself or Esther Larson know if you'd like to be involved, and we can get you hooked up with something. APA National has also adopted a policy guide for planning and climate change. It was adopted originally in 2008, last updated in April of 2011, and it lays out a series of strategies that planners should be focusing on, and some of the rationale for each of those strategies and some of the positives and minuses. I found it to be a very informative document, and I encourage you all to take a look at that. You can see that one on the national website under Outreach, and then look under Policy, Advocacy, and Law, and there's a series of policy briefs. APA Washington also recently worked on a project called the 10 Big Ideas that sought to trigger action and change on some fundamental issues of our time, and climate change was one of those. So take a look under the chapter website again for the 10 Big Ideas website, and there's a great 9-minute intro video. Our webinar technology, we weren't so sure if videos could work, otherwise we'd show it right now, but you can go ahead and take a look at it as soon as we're done here. I think it's very good. And I'd like to thank all the folks who worked on the 10 Big Ideas climate change project as well. So without further ado, we wanted to pull this webinar together to give, as Paula mentioned, some information on some of the latest and greatest with climate change action and some of the initiatives that have been in the works over this past year. And we have 3 speakers to help us get informed about this, and potentially, one of the things that APA Washington is going to be thinking about, and we'd love to hear your input on this, is to what degree to get engaged or potentially take a position on one or more of these efforts. And then when we're done here, we'd love to have some questions from the attendees, and we'll get right to it. So we have 3 speakers. There were 2 initiatives in the works for this year. There's and Duncan Clausen from Carbon Washington is going to address one of them. Becky Kelly is going to talk a little bit about the Alliance for Clean Jobs and Energy and their efforts on mitigating climate change, and then Michael Shaw, the chapter's legislative lobbyist, will speak to the overall situation in the legislature this year. So I'll give a little bit more of an introduction to each in turn. First, we have Duncan Clausen. He's co-director of Carbon Washington and passionate about distributed renewable energy and climate policy. Duncan earned a master's in public administration from the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. He's a Sustainable Energy Fellow and a former board fellow at EarthCorps. And when not working, you can find Duncan out hiking with his dog, climbing, or trying out a new recipe for dinner. Duncan, would you like to take us through the I-732 effort?
Happily. Thank you so much for the introduction, Yorick, and inviting us to come and present to you about Initiative 732. I have to say it's just really heartening to see the climate conversation, and particularly the conversation on pricing carbon, getting so much attention locally, nationally, and internationally. So definitely an honor to talk with you all today. So yeah, let me run you through Carbon Washington and our initiative 732. There we go. So first of all, who we are, we're a group of citizens, students, academics, and activists that all were incredibly passionate about pricing carbon and came together to put together a policy that we think we can really take us forward in terms of addressing climate change. We have about 30 chapters across the state with hundreds of volunteers working on this issue. And primarily, we work in living rooms, not boardrooms, coffee shops, things of that nature. We're kind of a nonprofit startup, if you will. And we're not really affiliated with any special interest or particular political party. So we really are coming at this independently with the goal of empowering citizens and reducing emissions, but in a way that can be replicable in places outside of Washington and hopefully create positive change. So to begin with, we really use British Columbia as a model. It's been widely regarded as the most effective climate policy in North America, if not the world. And here's just a couple of quotes talking about BC's carbon tax effort that was put in place in 2008. And I think probably my favorite one is that last one there. The shocking truth about BC's carbon tax is that it works. So I'll just run through a little bit about how BC's policy has been working, and then I'll draw the correlation about how 732 is is similar and point out a couple of differences as well. So British Columbia has what's called a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So between 2008 and 2014, you can see their price, which started at about $15 a ton, went up to $22 a ton Canadian, US, $30 a ton Canadian, raised about $5 billion in revenue, and was offset with a variety of tax cuts to business, low-income individuals, personal income tax reductions, and a couple of others. And you can see that their tax cuts exceeded their revenue by a little bit over that 6-year period. So in terms of effectiveness, we can see British Columbia's sales of refined petroleum products took a significant dive and reduction compared to the rest of Canada, which is what we want to see based on the price on carbon. But at the same time, their real GDP per capita has kept pace with the rest of Canada, and I believe it's actually exceeding it a little bit at this point. So here's Initiative 732. What do? We put a $25 per metric ton of CO2 emissions. We reduced the state sales tax 1 percentage point, so from 6.5% to 5.5%. We virtually eliminate the business and occupation tax on manufacturers, and we fund and also increase the working family tax rebate, which I'll get into a little bit more down the road here as well. The primary goal, let's cut carbon emissions. At the same time, we can take a whack at the regressive tax system we have here in Washington State, and hopefully be able to do all of that while encouraging bipartisan support. So we've been working on Initiative 732, collecting signatures starting in April of last year. And one of the things that we've been pretty happy about is being able to keep climate in the news. The efforts here in Washington State seem to be drawing lots of attention from a variety of reporting sources. So one of the questions that folks bring up to us is, why return the revenues rather than using that money to reinvest in other efforts that can reduce carbon pollution further? The simple place to start is really that a price on carbon, whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, is inherently regressive. It costs low and middle income families more and disproportionately more than higher income families. Particularly here in Washington State, tax increases are hard to sell politically, and revenue neutrality allows for some bipartisan support. So we have a couple of individuals and organizations listed there, kind of on both sides of the aisle. And finally, by funding the working families tax rebate here in Washington, we can improve the fairness of Washington's tax code. So here's an example of the impact of taxes on the various quintiles of earners. So in Oregon, you can see almost everyone pays roughly the same amount of their total income in state and local taxes. Idaho, also fairly equal across all of the earning brackets. California, again, not so bad. Washington State, this is the slide that always shocks me. Our lowest earners in the state pay the highest percentage of their total income in state and local taxes, where the highest earners pay the least amount of their total income in state and local taxes. With funding the working families rebate with I-732 and the revenue neutral carbon tax, we actually are able to reduce the burden of Washington State's tax structure on the lowest 40% of earners in the state. And then this slide is showing that the efficacy of a price on carbon, incredibly effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, as probably most people in the state have heard, if you read the comments on any sort of climate change measure or price on carbon, is what is it going to cost me as an individual or as a business? Fortunately, we were able to work with a couple of wonderful folks over at the university to develop this carbon tax swap calculator. So you can actually go to the web address at the top of the screen there, and you can play with the tool as an individual or a business to see how much 732 would impact you financially. As an example for myself, living in Seattle, driving my vehicle a little bit less than average, I would actually end up saving about $85 a year under Initiative 732. So where are we at? In 2015, we gathered over 362,000 signatures. That's the 10th highest number of signatures collected on an initiative in Washington State history. So we're incredibly proud of the work that we were able to put together, and inspired by the fact that so many people care about this issue to engage by signing on to a petition. We'd raised over $700,000 from over 1,000 individual donors. And one thing I like to point out is the amount of money that it took for us to qualify the initiative through the signature gathering phase is about half what a typical initiative would spend to qualify to go to the ballot or go in front of the legislature. Again, we have about 30 chapters of volunteers around the state, and we threw about 50 parties. We like to have a good time as much as we can dealing with a very serious issue. So for 2016, right now we're in front of the state legislature. I-732 is an initiative of the legislature, which is a little bit different than what a lot of people do with initiatives. So we have a few possibilities while it's in the legislature. They can either pass it outright, in which case it becomes law. The legislature can pass an alternative, which would likely be like a 732B. I don't know what the exact title would be. Or they can, the state legislature can do nothing, in which case I-732 goes onto the ballot in November. So we're coming up very quickly. Next week, March 10th, is the end of the legislative session. And after that, November 8th is our next big date, which is Election Day. And so we're very likely heading to the November ballot. There's still a little bit of a question mark as to what can happen this legislative session. There's also talk of a potential special session again, which I'm curious to see if that happens again this year. But regardless, we're very likely going to the ballot in November of this year. So finally, I'll kind of wrap up quick. Our strategy. We're going to run a campaign that's positive and really striving toward a better, greener future here in Washington State. We're going to do what we do best, and that's engaging person to person and working to make all those voter contacts early, since we're going to have a head start over any sort of other initiative to the people going to the ballot. And we're going to do everything we can to deploy new innovative tools to reach young voters. That's an incredibly important demographic. And we need to work like the whole world's at stake, which I think we all recognize is definitely the case. 732 has good support, but it's tight. Like Yaram is a big fan of saying, is carbon pricing is hard. So here's a couple of examples of polling that's been done nationally, and we think that it's indicative of what we're going to see here in Washington State. Why 2016? This is an incredibly important year for us to work to put a price on carbon. Presidential turnout is going to be huge. There's the potential for bipartisan support. And quite honestly, it's time for us to play offense. You know, holding the line is important, something that needs to be done, but let's get out there and work hard to take a step forward and play a little offense. And with that, just kind of a busy ending page, my contact information, our website, and a little inspiration there from Michael Jordan. So anyway, with that, I'll put myself on mute and say thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I appreciate the information. I like the quote, and I like the idea of mixing advocacy with parties. I think you may be onto something there. We did have a question that came in. I think we may as well just take it now, since it's specific to the Carbon Washington effort, which is from Michael Godfrey, who's wondering why eliminate the business occupation tax on manufacturers. I hope I got the acronym right. BO, tax on manufacturers. Duncan?
Yeah, the business and yeah. So the reason why we're virtually eliminating the business and occupation tax on manufacturing is they tend to represent a sector that's often referred to as energy-intensive, trade-exposed industry. And so essentially, if we don't work to balance the tax burden on those industries, there's a likelihood that they will either leave the states or leave the country. Negative for a couple of reasons. One, if they go someplace where there's no price on carbon, that's called leakage. So we're not able to capture those emissions and put a price on it and incent them to reduce their overall emissions. And two, we like to have, those living wage jobs here in Washington State. And it's, we don't like to see industry leaving, and that's the reason why we work to reduce or offset their carbon price to B&O tax reduction.
Great, thanks, Duncan. I see another question here, but it looks like that one might be appropriate for the whole group, so I'll hold that one until the end. I'm also looking, once we get to Mike Shaw, I'd love to hear from him if he's heard anything about the prospects for an I-732B as developed by the legislature as an alternative, or of course any alternatives that the legislature is cooking up on their own. And also whether we're looking at a special session. Yes, we can hear you. We're gonna hear from Becky first, and then I'll repeat those questions to Mike when we're ready.
Great. I've had technical difficulties, so I was a little panicked there for a bit.
Sure. Yep. No, you're coming through loud and clear. So our second speaker today, there's kind of a bounty of efforts going on within the state, which I think is capitalizing a little bit on this being a banner year for climate change in terms of the Paris Accords, some of the governor's efforts in this arena, and as Duncan mentioned, just the fact that it's getting towards time to act here. So in addition to Carbon Washington efforts, a coalition of groups have come together as the Alliance for Jobs in Clean Energy, and we're looking at pushing some action on climate change as well. To speak a little bit to the Alliance's efforts, we have Becky Kelly. Becky Kelly is the president of the Washington Environmental Council, and she joined the staff of that organization in 1994. She provides leadership on Washington Environmental Council's key policy initiatives, including climate change, clean energy, Puget Sound restoration, and forest protection. And Becky has been deeply engaged in the development of the Alliance for Jobs in Clean Energy, serving as co-chair of the Alliance Steering Committee and a member of its governance board. Becky has a bachelor's degree in international studies from the University of Oregon, and I really appreciate her being able to take a little bit of time out of her schedule to give us an update on where the Alliance for Jobs in Clean Energy is at. Becky, you want to take it away?
Yep, thanks so much, Yorick. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today and to the American Planning Association for prioritizing the issue of climate change. I can only imagine in your jobs, your varied jobs, that you starkly see what's coming at us and how much it's going to impact our society, and appreciate that you're motivated to act as a professional society. And you're planners, so while we find that this challenge is one that is sometimes hard for our species to get its head around, I feel like planners are probably better than most at understanding what's coming and that we need to do something to change our trajectory. So I'm the president of Washington Environmental Council. We're a nonprofit advocacy group that works primarily at the state level for environmental protection across the state of Washington. We're a founding member of the Alliance for Jobs in Clean Energy. And we have been working on climate issues for many years at the state level. In 2008, we helped pass through the legislature a state law that establishes greenhouse gas emissions limits. But since then, we have been struggling to work with the state to enact tools that will allow us to achieve those limits. And we've learned a lot during that intervening 8 years about what it takes to do this heavy lift of beginning to transition how we power our entire economy. And it is a generational challenge that I imagine all of us on this call will be dealing with for the rest of our lives. So we realized we needed that bigger coalition. We helped bring such a coalition together in 2015, the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy. You can find us online at jobscleanenergywa.com. And it's made up of businesses, environmental groups, labor unions, communities of color and social justice organizations, public health, faith, families, and others. This webinar falls at a slightly tricky time in terms of being as definitive as I might like to be, but I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you where we're at. And there will be a little bit of an element of, stay tuned for further details. But as we announced last fall, the Alliance had planned to move ahead with a ballot initiative to put a price on carbon pollution and invest the proceeds in making a smart transition to a cleaner energy economy if we were able to avoid having two competing climate ballot measures on the ballot in November. We worked very hard to achieve that in 2015, particularly through some talks with Carbon Washington in December, but were unsuccessful. So we'll soon be finalizing our plans for 2016, but I will say at this point that it is unlikely that we will bring forward a carbon pricing ballot measure this year. That said, we have worked hard to develop a policy that our broad coalition can support, and we're continuing to work to finalize that policy, to organize around it across the state, and to build the kind of robust movement and campaign that will ultimately be needed to get it adopted. So while we wish we were doing that this year, it seems unlikely that we will be able to do it this year, and we'll probably need to keep working on it. So in terms of part of, just to underline, I guess, again, why we think that this broad coalition is really important in terms of not just a feel-good, but in terms of achieving the substance of it. Shifting how our economy is powered, getting off of fossil fuels over time and onto renewables, and energy efficiency and so forth. We have to pass something, but we also have to sustain it and ensure that it's implemented and funded over time. And I know many of you work in government, state, and local, and are probably painfully aware of the fact that there's policy and then there's what happens, and that having a sort of sustained constituency for an idea is pretty key to having it succeed over time. So we need a policy that works for and is supported by the public and a broad cross-section of society. And that's, again, kind of the theory of change that the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy is working with. We have the Washington Businesses for Climate Action, which is a group of over 250 companies who support clean energy, energy efficiency, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and they have been part of our efforts. We've also looked both north and south, as Duncan mentioned, to British Columbia and to California. British Columbia, their example has some benefits for us and some lessons for us. It's actually the price of carbon was meant to keep increasing in British Columbia, and they put a halt to increasing the price and have seen their emissions reductions begin to stall. That I believe they put a halt to the price increases in 2012 because they're really waiting for other jurisdictions to join them. And California voters, in California we saw that racial justice groups and social justice groups challenged their cap and trade plan in court multiple times and made changes to it through the legislature. So as much as possible, we're trying to learn from the examples of other jurisdictions and build something from the start that will be durable. So the kind of policy that we think can bring that kind of support in Washington has three key features. One is a cap on carbon pollution, which ensures that we get to those reductions that science says are needed to keep life viable here. The second is to put a fee on carbon pollution so that we internalize the currently externalized costs of that pollution and really have our economic system reflect the true cost of using fossil fuels. And then the third component, and it's the place where you'll see a strong difference between our approach and the Initiative 732 approach is a reinvestment of the funds that are garnered through the price on carbon into projects that solve the problem, accelerate the transition to clean and efficient use of energy, and then also pave the way for a just transition, both for workers who are impacted by the change in jobs that comes as we wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, and for disadvantaged and communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by climate change and disproportionately impacted by the lift of the transition. The good news in all this, I keep talking about how big it is and how hard it is, and I know Duncan talked about that as well. I think the good news is that we do think that Washington as a state is well positioned to lead in this area, ultimately to show how to do it right in a way that works for folks across the economy and across society, and frankly to benefit economically because of our innovation economy and the fact that we're good at building new things and doing things in new ways. And ultimately, we believe that it can be a really positive transition for our state. So I wanted to talk just a little bit more about the kind of investment strategy because, as I said, that is an important way in which our approach differs from 732. And the critical investment areas that we see fall into three buckets. One is providing a just transition for workers and industries and protection for disadvantaged communities. The second bucket is really around climate resilience and adaptation, which I'm sure many of you are dealing with in your work lives, and looking at how, as we deal with climate change in Washington and its impacts on our infrastructure and so forth, what can we do in terms of creating more resilient forests and creating better water infrastructure, a little bit on the mitigation side, but frankly primarily on the adaptation side, so that as we're beginning to experience the impacts of climate, like flooding, increased flooding, how can we invest in some of those solutions, because those things are upon us and they're going to be expensive. And then the third bucket is really around, I think of it as kind of spinning the wheel faster in terms of accelerating the transition to cleaner energy sources and a cleaner economy. A price on carbon, a cap on carbon pollution, they both send market signals, but investment, direct investment into clean technologies is another way to accelerate the pace of change. So those are the main areas that we think are going to be really important for investment. I can speak further to any of them. We've thought through a lot about them. Certainly agree with Kyle that energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, primarily in the manufacturing sector, things like steel and aluminum that face high energy needs as a part of the way they make their product and that are subject to global competition and markets where carbon may not be priced. We don't want to offshore those jobs. We don't want to drive that carbon pollution to economies where it won't be regulated and reduced. And so we're also supportive of building some flexibility into the system. We would most likely have some basic requirements for those industries to do what they can that's cost effective to make their processes more efficient. But beyond that, we would likely rebate the carbon cost of compliance. But over time, bend that curve down. And then I will say, a very important part of our coalition makeup, and it's been a big shift for my organization. We're coming up on 50 years as a environmental advocacy group in Washington, and like most environmental advocacy groups, have been a pretty majority white, middle to upper middle class sort of organization, and we're doing a lot of organizational work to understand how we can better reflect the citizens of this state and the broad range of needs that people have and the folks who are part of our society. And one of the things that I'm proud of about the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy is that it has amongst its leadership folks from communities of color-led organizations, and they are at the table helping create these policy solutions with us. And one of the things that's really important is that the solutions be equitable and that there be investments in those communities. The Working Families Tax Rebate is something that we are supportive of, but we don't see it as sufficient. It only reaches about 47% of the people who we would all want it to reach in terms of low-income folks. And the other thing is that it basically is a cash rebate. And a lot of what we find that disadvantaged communities need is more communal structured infrastructure investments. Things like provisions to clean up diesel emissions at ports, investments in transit, investments in affordable housing near transit. And some of those sort of societal investments are things that people aren't going to be able to buy with a $50 check or $200 check. And so that's been a piece of what our communities of color partners have brought to the table in terms of shaping the investments the way that we are talking about shaping them. So there's a lot there. I could keep talking. I know sometimes it's hard without slides to focus as well. I'm happy to dig in on any of the pieces. But I would say, you know, we strongly agree with Carbon Washington that it is really important to put a price on carbon pollution. We have a very different vision of how to do that. I wish that we did not find ourselves in this situation where we're not all aligned in what is a really politically opportune year to try to do something in Washington. But I think the stakes are high enough and the scale of the transition is significant enough that it is worth getting it right, building the broad coalition, meeting the needs of a wide range of folks throughout society, and businesses, workers, disadvantaged communities, families, public health officials, and building a platform that we think can have really broad support and buy-in. And so if it takes a little bit longer to get there, we are willing to take a little bit longer to get there and think in the long run that kind of do it right and take care of folks in the transition will serve us well.
Thank you very much, Becky. I appreciate the information. As you mentioned, this is coming at a dynamic time for the Alliance, so I appreciate being able to pause and give kind of an update on the state of affairs right now. I think it's one of the reasons that we wanted to do this webinar is that it's rare to have kind of competing initiative efforts that are quite a bit the same in terms of their intentions and just a little bit different on the approach. And that's one of the things that we wanted to give a little bit for our membership to think about in terms of sorting through some of this stuff. So we have a couple good questions that we've come up, but I wanted to give Mike Shaw an opportunity to give us the lowdown on what's going on in Olympia, maybe give us some perspective on prospects for this year, maybe a little bit about what he might see going forward in the future. I'm specifically curious again if he's heard anything about prospects for an I-732B, whether there will be a special session this year. Of course, a lot of this is the stuff of rumors at this point probably, but some of those can be interesting rumors. And we've got a deadline today for in the legislature, so I know there's a lot of activity going on down there, so I appreciate you taking some time out. And then we'll get into some questions for all three of our speakers after Michael gives us a little rundown. Michael, actually I've got a little intro for Michael here too. So Michael Shaw is APA Washington's contract lobbyist, and he has been for about 12 years. Michael does a great job, especially during the legislative session, keeping the legislative committee informed on the latest in Olympia. Michael pulls together lists of bills of interest for the legislative committees to discuss, review, and potentially take a position on with the support of the chapter leadership. And Michael passes along board positions and conversations with legislators and signs into committee hearings on bills with our support or opposition, and generally is present in the Capitol and does a lot of the APA Washington's public face to other advocacy groups, other professional organizations, and to the legislative community. Michael's been working in Olympia for 23 sessions and lobbies primarily on local government issues and has a few other clients as well. Michael, do you want to take it away?
Certainly. I'll just kind of refute some of the facts that you've already kind of touched on. One, today is a big cutoff Today, the House and Senate have until 5 p.m. to, for instance, in the Senate to hear the House bills that have come over, and for the House to hear the Senate bills. So if bills don't make it by 5 o'clock today, they're pretty much done. And then next week we'll start sorting through the bills that were amended in the other chambers and such, and kind of wait on the budgets. But I'll touch on that again later. So let me first get to the climate-specific bills. There were a number of bills that were introduced this session that pretty much went nowhere. There was a bill that would just prohibit rules and policies that would limit greenhouse gases that was dropped by Senator Erickson. He did that relatively early. It went nowhere, and it died long ago. And as almost a kind of pro forma action, both the House and the Senate dropped bills that are essentially title-only bills. There's no substance to them, but the titles are I-732 alternative. There's in the Senate it's 6381, and in the House it's House Bill 2777. And so there are vehicles that could be snatched up, and they could throw language on that they could put out for an alternative. But I don't think there's any consensus, any ability to get that done in what we're supposed to end the session next Thursday. So I really don't see that happening. There was a bill that was introduced and actually had a hearing that could have been an alternative, and that's Senate Bill 6306. It was dropped by Senator Hobbs. He wanted to start the conversation. His bill was a carbon tax, I believe, was $8 per metric ton. And I think what was interesting about his bill is he actually set out the expenditures, a quarter of the money for public transportation, a quarter for storm. He put in his bill how the money would be spent. It had a hearing. It went nowhere, and I'm pretty sure I can say that it is done. That bill's done. So, given the lack of time left, given that you have a very big split, for instance, in the Senate alternative title on the bills sponsored by Senator Erickson, let's put this way, I'm not sure he agrees about that human, that climate change is a product of man-made, or again, I'm not sure what his thinking is at this point. The other bill in the House, sponsored by Representative Joe McDermott, who's chair of the Environment Committee, very much climate change advocate as far as addressing the impacts of climate change. So it's hard to see a path that either of these, that the House and Senate could find to get something on the ballot. And it was interesting that when that one bill I mentioned earlier was at a hearing, you could see the business community wasn't quite sure. Do we want to put an alternative out there, or how do they want to play it? What's the optics for the next election coming up? So I guess short story here, there will be no option placed on the ballot. I cannot foresee that at this point. So as far as prospects for this year, we're going to try to get through this next week. I don't think you're going to see that happen. Matter of fact, there's now whispers that we might even not be able to get agreement on a supplemental operating budget, which would be the first time in my 23 years of being down here that would happen. Their approaches are so different. People, frankly, are worn out from last year's marathon special sessions, and they could, in the House, they're talking about, hey, maybe we don't have a budget, maybe we don't have a capital budget, maybe we just deal with it, push it off to January and do it in this third supplemental budget. In the Senate, the whispers have started about a special session, so which is depressing to no end that they would even consider it. I think we all hoped we'd get out on time, but the whispers are now that they will have a special session, that they feel more time is needed to get the budgets done and to get out of here. So that's kind of where we're at this year. As far as prospects for next year, oh my, that's going to be a tough one, because of course we have this major election. The whole House is up for election, and it's such a close split between the majority Democrats and the minority Republicans. So 50 50-48, and there are a number of districts that will be in play during this election that could put us into a tie. So next year they're going to have to deal with the K-12 McCleary. They're going to have to deal with, we know will be at least $1 billion in the hole just on the general fund. You're going to have even tighter, perhaps, divisions between the Senate and the House, and of course, a presidential race that will cause, no doubt, some lingering animosity in the governor's race. So I don't think any of us are looking forward to next year. So that, I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling. I hate to leave you with that cheery note. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Mike, for the upbeat assessment of the situation in the legislature. I think it's things like that have folks considering going the initiative route and potentially bypassing the legislature altogether.
I could definitely see. In New York, the only thing I'd say is that we might set a record for the least amount of bills passed.
Which was that was last year's record already, wasn't it?
Yeah, but that's a long session. I mean, in a short session, we're going to break that one this time.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. We got about 15 minutes left, so I think a good amount of time to get some questions. We have a couple here, and if folks have any others, go ahead and type them into that question box that's on your webinar screen there. We got a relatively simple one for Duncan on this initiative. Would it take a simple majority to pass the initiative that goes to the people? Duncan, that's something I should know. I think I know, but
yeah, it's just a simple majority. That's a ballot to pass.
Okay. And then while we've got you, I wonder if you had any sort of a response to some of so between the two initiatives, of course, the biggest difference in them is one is revenue neutral and the other one applies some of the revenue that's gained through carbon pricing to some of the efforts that Becky mentioned, including adaptation, some equity-related investments in clean technology to support jobs and all that. Did you have any sort of a response to the thinking behind the Carbon Washington cash rebate? I don't know if that's too simple of a way to describe it, but that method. Did you have any thoughts on kind of why Carbon Washington went the way it did? And
yeah, absolutely. There's, I think, two pieces to your question that I want to pull out. One is, in no uncertain terms, there's one initiative moving forward right now, and that's 732. There's a desire to do a different approach, and the possibility of doing that through an initiative, as Becky was talking about. But there's one initiative that's active right now that's moving forward, and that's Carbon Washington and Initiative 732. In terms of the structure of putting a price on carbon, I think number one is the regressivity issue and making sure that, particularly in Washington State, we have a mechanism that protects low-income families. So the Working Families Rebate does have some limited reach in its ability, but it is something that was passed in the state, but it's never been funded. So we think that there's a value in funding that and funding it at a higher level than what it was passed at. The other component to Initiative 732 is the 1 percentage point reduction in the state sales tax, and that reaches everyone who buys goods in the state. So not something specifically addressing regressivity, but something that is reaching everyone in the state, whereas a lot of programs, targeted programs, are difficult to reach everyone in the state, and I think that's something that we all recognize and work to try and find a solution there. And lastly, I'll say in terms of kind of philosophy, you know, I take some offense, all due respect, Becky, with your comment on hastily creating policy and making sure that we take the time to do it right. And you mentioned that we did work together in the final hours of 2015 to try and find a way to do something different. And if that's not hastily doing work, I'm not certain what is. And we're in a position where we are not really able to take any more time in addressing climate change and doing something. I-732 is not perfect. I don't think any policy is perfect, but we believe that it is an equitable policy, that it is a policy that is politically viable, and that there's definitely some other great things that should be done in our state, and we would be happy to work to make those things a reality in the future. But when it comes to pricing carbon and taking action on climate, we think 732 is the best policy we have because it's the policy we have in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, and I appreciate those thoughts. Let's see what we have here. We've got a question for Becky here. Why doesn't the Alliance think pass the initiative now and then work to make it better to address the issues she's raised? To address Bob Drewell, who was a Snohomish County executive and the executive director of the Puget Sound Regional Council for a number of years, is waiting for the perfect getting in the way of supporting the good. And I'll close that question by wondering if the Alliance had considered getting behind this initiative as the one that's going this year, perhaps as a this fits our needs, but if it doesn't work, we'll keep trying next year. But to express some level of support. Is that something that the Alliance has talked about?
Thanks for that question. I think that is, in matters of public policy, it feels like in the work I've done in the last 20 plus years on environmental public policy, that often is what we boil down to. It's like, when is it good enough? When do you take a piece and move forward? And and I think this is, and it's an important question. It always is. I think I find that question to be particularly pointed in matters of the legislature, because the legislature is inherently a political compromise. It is not where you get your most bold policy generally, not that often, certainly not in recent years, as we heard your lobbyists talk about. I think for an initiative, I think the bar is a little bit higher because it's actually being brought by the citizens, and it requires mounting generally an intense and expensive campaign to win, particularly in the face of what we expect to be strong opposition from the fossil fuel industry. And again, I think we're at this moment in time in terms of what's happening in society and in our state at this sort of pinnacle of political divisiveness and income inequality and grappling with questions of racial justice, when it's a really important time to get it right, and it's a really important time to build bridges with people with whom we want to be creating this new economy. And I don't think those folks, and I know because they have a couple of key constituencies have come out opposed to I-732. The Washington State Labor Council has voted to oppose it. And my understanding is the Communities of Color Coalition around Climate Justice, which is called Front and Centered, is opposing it as well. And I think their perspective on the question that was asked, which is, can't we pass this now? We really desperately need to do something, and can we fix it in the future? Is that we actually need to get it right now, because so often we've seen we can't fix it in the future. The legislature generally nibbles away at good ideas or doesn't adequately fund them over time. We don't see, particularly for bold policies like shifting how we power our economy, we don't generally see that they come back and fix the problems and strengthen them. The other thing that is a disputed matter and complex, but there is concern that I-732 is not revenue neutral. So for some of these constituencies who are already significantly disproportionately not doing well in our society, the idea of putting a bigger hole in the general fund is very concerning. and there really isn't, you can't just sort of hope that that will get fixed in the future, given our legislature's performance on its paramount duty of education, among other things. It doesn't give us a lot of hope that they're going to fix this if there is a budget hole from 732. So that's a long answer. I think it's a great question. It's a question I respect. It's a question that I think thoughtful people have to ask themselves. We have asked ourselves that, and the way I just described is kind of how we've answered it.
Thanks, Becky. And that's a question that this chapter of APA we'll have to ask ourselves as well. Next question, and let's turn this over to both Duncan and Becky. Why don't we start with Duncan, and then Becky, if you have anything to add. Is there no other way to mitigate climate change as opposed to some type of new tax? And I'll just editorialize a little bit. This is part of what planners' roles are in carrying out portions of state law that already do address climate change, and a lot of local communities and actions address climate change, and I think a lot of the work will fall to planners, even if some sort of a pricing mechanism is adopted in terms of dealing with the effects of it, dealing with the transition in some of the built environment that would trigger, also working with adaptation of climate change. I've just been reading through this National APA Policy Guide that covers about 4 different ways that planners will be called on to address climate change, including working with best possible science, producing data, information, and resources to help policymakers interpret these changes, and tailoring some of the responses to individual areas, because not a one-size-fits-all approach does not work, as well as helping the communication aspect of it. But on the table right here, we have 2 direct pricing only initiatives. Duncan, do you want to address a little bit on how I assume the idea started with action on climate change rather than started with we need a new tax? So what brought you and your group from deciding that action was warranted to deciding on this pricing mechanism as the preferred way?
Yeah, that great question. Thank you. A couple of different things I can say. First of all, Yoram, who is the chair of Carbon Washington, is an environmental economist, so he tends to look at the problem through a particular lens. For those who are not aware, he worked as a fellow at the Sightline Institute, a local think tank here in Seattle, for a number of years, and he, along with Alan Durning, wrote a book in 1998 called Tax Shift, which apparently was mentioned by the Premier of British Columbia as being one of the influential texts for them putting in place a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So there's a long history of Yoram in particular working on this issue from that perspective. And for myself, what I will say is how I really got involved with Yoram and the pricing carbon ideas. He was a professor of mine while I was at the University of Washington, and I did what was called a multiple scenario economic feasibility study. Sounds really fun, and for those of you who work in government, probably not a title that wouldn't necessarily be in the running for a really great acronym if we did it right. And in that, I looked at a couple of different things, including net metering, what's called a cogeneration heat credit, looking at a price on carbon, the change in the price of electricity as a result of a price on carbon. And quite honestly, the price on carbon was basically the most efficient tool from the research that I was able to do. And I guess that brings us back up to the high level is how can you mitigate carbon emissions and address climate change? And that is you can put a price on carbon, either through a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. And there's many, many varieties of pricing mechanisms, or you can take a regulatory approach. And so there are options out there. I think Carbon Washington really took to the revenue neutral carbon taxes being something that was equitable, something that was politically viable, and something that's been regarded by many as being the most successful climate policy in North America, if not the world, which is the revenue neutral carbon tax in British Columbia. So hopefully that answers all the questions there.
Great, thanks, Duncan. We just have a few minutes left, but Becky, did you have any thoughts on the same question? So how did your group arrive among, presumably this started as an initiative to take action on climate mitigation, and how did you arrive at this particular solution?
Yep, that's a great question. Similarly to what Duncan was saying, the one thing I'll say is that it does take a portfolio of approaches, policies, spending, government programs, private activities and investments, et cetera. The transition we're trying to make is such a profound one, and it reaches into our economy and our society so deeply that there's no silver bullet in this case. California, I think their cap and trade program is projected to deliver about 20% of their emissions reductions. They have, many of you may have looked at their programs, they have an incredibly broad array of other policies and programs, everything ranging from standards requiring cleaner fuels to building energy efficiency, on and on and on, that is driving their carbon curve downward pretty steeply. But it's an all of the above strategy. The significance of the price on carbon pollution and why it's seen as often as a centerpiece is that it provides an overarching economy-wide mechanism to signal clearly and in a long-term way that investments in cleaner, more efficient energy production and use are going to be rewarded, and dirty energy investments are over time going to be more costly. So ironically, sometimes I think given kind of where we're at in this country, cap and trade was invented by Republican nationally administrations as just a very economically efficient way to get the economy to make decisions that are less favorable to pollution and more favorable to clean. So it's a bit of an engine, it's a bit of a signal, a driver that makes all your other changes that you want to make cheaper and faster. So that's the significance of it, but it's in no way sufficient. It's a tool among many.
Yes. Well, thank you, Becky, and I definitely agree with that. Again, as planners, I think we all have an important role in this effort, mitigating, adapting, communicating, dealing with the effects and all of that. So I just want to give a really big thank you to Duncan, Becky, and Michael for taking time to inform us about some of these initiatives and legislative efforts that are going on. I appreciate all of your work at tackling this issue through multiple different means. I wish both of these efforts the best, and of course, to Mike's side, I wish the legislature the best in general. They've got a lot of tough work to do. We all have a lot of tough work to do. So thank you again. Yes.
York, I was just going to ask if I could quickly just announce again the efforts of our climate. This is Paula Reeves, our APA Washington chapter president. I just wanted, before we all sign off, I just wanted to remind you all to please contact us if you'd like. Contact me, contact Yorick if you'd like to get engaged with Justice Stewart and this discussion. We'll be doing some further analysis of these various initiatives and efforts, and we'll make the presentation materials from today available to you. Your good questions will not be lost. We will endeavor to get answers back to you on those. I'm sure Yorick will follow up. We thank again our great speakers today. Check our website for additional information. It's washington-apa.org. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.